Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. In the history of bad games, none are as infamous as today's game, Ride To Hell Retribution, a 2013 game that was initially stuck in development hell, and it launched what can be best described as universal panning, becoming nothing more than the butt of its fair share of jokes. Ride To Hell Retribution is the poster child of bad games, especially from that era. So 12 years later, I decided to find out, is it really that bad? So as taking out the trash goes, we're going to look at the good, the just okay, and the outright bad. As we always do, let's start out with the good. I think we're going to have a hard time selling much of anything about Ride To Hell Retribution, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have some good points. First and foremost, the game's soundtrack is actually pretty solid. I actually kind of enjoyed listening to it outside of the game. I wouldn't say it's the greatest thing I've ever heard by any means, but it's very fitting with the overall aesthetic of the game. It's a blues rock inspired OST that's just as fitting here as it would be in a 60s or 70s action flick. Secondly, the amount of locations we get to visit are surprisingly varied. I was taken back by the amount of locations that we get to see. I expected to see things get recycled constantly. Now, by no means is this game great visually, it's pretty average for the time, if not a little behind. But I will say, I do appreciate all the different locales. From a desert, graveyard, a farm, a city, and even a small rundown town, along with several others, you don't really get a ton of repeat visits. However, it is important to note as you get towards the end of the game, you will start to see a few repeat locations. It's not too many that it's offensive by any means, but it's definitely noticeable by the very end. With that said, if you're not really willing to put up with this game's nonsense, you probably won't end up seeing these repeat locations. I'll need you to hear me out on this, but please do. The story isn't actually that bad either. Well, at least the premise. Now don't get me wrong, it's not delivered well in the slightest, and if anything, it's done so poorly you can easily forget what the actual plot is. But the premise is a revenge story mixed with a blood feud. It has a lot of potential. Sadly, it doesn't deliver anything like that, and it ends up coming across as a bad Sons of Anarchy fanfiction, but the idea is ultimately there, which leads to probably the last good point, and that is the game is so bad and awkward at its delivery that it's kinda good. Like the B movie that you can't look away from. It's a train wreck. From the strange voiceover choices.
That's a really, really bad thing.
Mm-hmm. You must be 666. Greasy Steve said you'd find me. Right before he exploded.
And the absolutely unhinged, fully clothed sex scenes. It's a game worth at the very least watching a playthrough of. Moving into the just okay, this is where a lot of the core gameplay for Ride To Hell Retribution lands for me. However, before I continue, I do want to let you know that I played the PC version, where I was able to edit the INI file to turn off mouse acceleration, making it a lot better. And also, I do want to note that the PC release is slightly better than the console version, at least by any reports that I could find. Ultimately, I say this because the core combat itself is alright. It's not particularly great. There is a combo system that may or may not work, and a reasonable variety of weapons. However, those weapons do kind of feel same in their respective categories, meaning all the pistols felt the same, melee and rifles and so on. Also, I can't speak for playing on any other difficulty since I played on the easy difficulty because I was not going to suffer any longer than I needed to, but every single weapon felt as powerful as one another, meaning pistols could one-shot everyone the same way rifles could, which made headshots super rewarding, which, although appreciated, means no one gun was outright better than another, which really shows the lack of enemy variety overall. Now, there is one enemy type that was able to survive against headshots consistently, and that's the one that wears the hockey mask. However, if you have a grenade, they're easy pickings. On paper, there seems to be quite a few different enemies. You know, you have ones with guns, melee, the different type of weapons, but ultimately they all have the same AI for the most part, making them all feel pretty much identical. I mentioned before that the game is not exactly the greatest visually, and I will say the general presentation for its overall graphics design is okay. Characters themselves are pretty damn ugly and lack any good animation, but the texture work is about on par with what you would expect of the era. It's a little dated, sure, since it was coming out towards the end of that generation's life cycle, but it's not so bad that it's a big deal. The general control of the game is also just okay. It's not perfect, but it's functional enough that you won't run into any major problems. The only real issue I had was with aiming, and that was more to do with the vertical than the horizontal. Horizontal, I had no issues, but the vertical aiming felt stiff. It might not necessarily show on the footage, but it definitely felt a little more tricky to line up the exact shot that I wanted. It just wasn't as smooth as you might hope. I'm sure you can play around with the INI files in order to get things fixed, but I really didn't care enough to spend hours doing that just to have a slightly better time in a subpar game. Finally, we move into the bad, and I honestly do not know where to begin. Do I start with the horrible character models, the downright atrocious voice acting, or as mentioned, the terrible incredibly delivered story? Well, it's gotta be the bike sections. Never have I ever played a single game in my life that made motorbikes seem so Being a glorified auto-scroller, these bike sections sadly come off as boring and do nothing for the overall action of the game. It didn't matter how many enemy bikers were on the road with you, because half of them would just crash and explode on their own, and the other half would force you into quick time events in order to beat them. Enemies will also always be able to catch up with you no matter what you do, making the boost feel pointless, but more on that in a quick second. And if they were far enough ahead, they tend to just drive in circles. You would think that boost would allow you to either escape the enemies or catch up with those ones driving in circles, but honestly, you never have a clue when it's going to work. It had a mind of its own. I had no idea when it would kick in or how long it would last. It just did what it wanted to. It was really random. Another point of randomness that gets added during the bike sections are the combat moments where you will go into slow motion, where you're meant to use your guns to shoot enemies instead of the quick time event battles. On paper, that seems like a fine way to make aiming well on the bike a lot easier, and although I appreciate the thought, the slow motion is seemingly tied to the enemy bikes and not the enemies themselves, at least from what I could determine, meaning you would have to wait for the bikes themselves to crash and explode, not the enemies die. If you happen to have got past an enemy and they don't catch up to you, well, now you're stuck in slow motion and there's not much you can do about it. You either have to finish the section or restart at a checkpoint, which thankfully the game is pretty generous with those, and if you fail a timed section, you'll get to restart at a checkpoint with more time to ensure that you don't get stuck in a never-ending loop, which I do have to give the game props for doing that. However, functionally it means you need to take out every enemy incredibly quickly, otherwise you might get stuck in slow motion until you finish that given section of the game. Ultimately, the issues I mentioned before aren't even close to the biggest problem Ride To Hell Retribution has. I love dark humor. I'm no prude. I love my edgy jokes when they are just that, a joke. But Ride To Hell Retribution has to be either intentionally or unintentionally the most misogynistic game ever created. So much so that I actually noticed, and I'm someone who doesn't care about politics in games. Outside of a very select handful of games that are meant to be misogynistic, this has to be the worst. I say this because with the exception of 3 female characters, 2 of which are designed in which your character is expected to sleep with, every single woman in this game is nothing more than a sex object. Saved a girl, dry hump. Girl gets stood up and you just so happen to pull up, dry hump. Breathe, dry hump. Every single woman is nothing more than an object. Look, I love titties, I do, just as much as any man, but I'm ugly and have zero chance of finding someone since going outside causes a massive anxiety attack for me. But my god, never have I felt more like an old Christian white woman in middle America thinking,
"Somebody please think of the children!"
There's edgy, and then there's games trying so hard to be edgy like Hatred, and if you're being mentioned in the same breath as that game, you probably suck. With this said, does it mean you should avoid it like the plague? No. Just go in understanding this is nothing more than a 14-year-old's ideal wet dream. It's also what a 14-year-old might think is cool, with about as much skill behind the coding as them making their first game, so it kind of tracks. It's a train wreck that is impossible to look away from. So much so that I can say it's worth playing, or at least watching a playthrough of, to see the absolute insanity that is Ride To Hell Retribution. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another episode. I hope you enjoyed this look at Ride To Hell Retribution. If you want to try the game for yourself, I will have a link for it down below. It is on myabandonware.com. Do note, if you try to get it to work with the no CD crack, you might run into an issue putting in the DLL files, and that is because Windows Defender will automatically delete it because it sees it as a virus. So you might need to just allow that specific file. I personally never ran into any issues, but just be warned that it does from time to time pop up as seen as one, so just keep that in mind. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting that like button. If you want to go that extra step, you can hit the subscribe button, and if you want to go that extra mile, you can support me on Ko-fi, Patreon, or YouTube memberships like these lovely people here. With that said, you should join the Discord, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay safe out there. Bye.